The first-class cabin was serene, the kind of silence only money could buy. That was until flight attendant Ms. Radley began her slow march down the aisle, her eyes locked onto two young passengers seated quietly in 2A and 2B. Something in her gaze flickered. Skepticism? Disapproval? She approached with stiff, purposeful strides. "You'll need to move," she said curtly. The girl looked up, startled. "I'm sorry." "What?" "These aren't your seats." Radley's voice sharpened, cold and direct. The boy glanced at his sister, confused. "But they are. We're in 2A and 2B. By now, heads began to turn. Whispers carried softly through the cabin like wind through tall grass. And just like that, things escalated. Within minutes, airport security stood at the front of the aircraft and the two young passengers were escorted off. Confused, embarrassed, and entirely unaware of the one truth that would turn everything on its head. Their father owned the airline. And once he found out, it wouldn't just be a mistake for Ms. Radley. It would be a decision she'd regret for the rest of her career. The story began at Halden International Airport, buzzing with the usual energy of morning departures. Announcements echoed overhead as people hustled through the gate areas, clutching coffee and rolling bags behind them. Among the travelers stood two siblings, Lena Carter, 17, composed and observant, and her 12-year-old brother, Toby Carter, who rocked lightly on his heels, practically vibrating with anticipation. Lena glanced down at her phone one last time. Gate E7. On time. She tucked the device into her jacket and gave a small nod. "How much longer?" Toby asked, his backpack slung off one shoulder. "Any minute now," she replied. They should call Group 1 soon. Their father had surprised them with first-class tickets, a rare luxury. Lena could tell Toby had been dreaming about this ever since he saw the boarding passes. His eyes had lit up like it was Christmas. When their group was called, they stepped forward, handing over their passes to the gate agent. The woman barely looked up before scanning them in and waving them through. The moment they stepped onto the plane, Toby's breath caught. Whoa! First class was a world of its own. The plush leather seats, the soft lighting, the absence of noise and clutter. Everything was pristine and calm. Toby whispered under his breath, spinning in place to take it all in. Lena smiled and gave him a gentle nudge. "Come on, let's find our seats." They located 2A and 2B, stowed their bags in the overhead bin, and settled in. Lena fastened her seatbelt, already feeling the comfort of the extra legroom. Toby leaned toward the window, watching the bustle on the tarmac with fascination. Further up the aisle, Miss Radley continued making her rounds. She was tall, polished, and rigid, her navy uniform crisp and every movement perfectly measured. She paused occasionally to greet passengers with a professional nod, but as she neared Lena and Toby's row, something changed. Her steps slowed, her smile faded. She stopped. "Excuse me," she said, voice cool. "Are you sure you're in the correct seats?" Lena looked up, confused. "Yes, 2A and 2B. Let me see your boarding passes," Ms. Radley said, extending her hand. Lena handed them over. The attendant studied them closely, her expression unmoving, but her knuckles tightened around the paper just slightly before handing them back. "This is the first-class cabin," she said flatly, as if it were some kind of revelation. "We know," Lena said, her voice calm but clipped. "Who booked these seats for you?" "Our father," she replied, her jaw tightening as she sensed something was off. Miss Radley didn't speak. She merely nodded once and walked away. Not far, just enough to whisper to someone out of earshot. Toby leaned in. Why'd she ask that? I don't know, Lena replied, but her gut twisted. Moments later, Ms. Radley returned, this time with an older male attendant, Mr. Carlyle. He was stern-looking, with gray streaks in his hair and an air of authority. He spoke without preamble. "We'll need you to step out of the cabin for a moment," he said. Lena blinked. "Why?" "We need to verify your seats." "We already showed you our tickets," Lena said, more firmly this time. "It won't take long. Please." Toby's excitement drained from his face. "Why do we have to go?" Ms. Radley folded her arms. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call security." Her tone wasn't just firm, it was threatening. Lena could feel it now, the eyes of the other passengers watching them, judging. But no one said a word. She reached for her bag and stood, nodding for Toby to follow. He hesitated, his head low as they made their way down the aisle, silent under the weight of a humiliation neither of them deserved. Toby hesitated at the top of the jet bridge but followed his sister silently, his head low, shoulders heavy. Whispers trailed behind them like smoke, but not a single voice rose in their defense. As the cabin doors sealed shut behind them with a sterile hiss, the world seemed to shift. Outside, a uniformed security officer stood by the gate, posture rigid, eyes watching them not with concern, but suspicion. As if they were troublemakers instead of travelers. Lena's hands shook as she unlocked her phone, her thumb trembling over the screen. She scrolled to her father's number and hit call. The phone rang once. "Dad?" Her voice cracked the moment he answered. "They kicked us off the plane." There was silence on the other end, not the kind that came from shock, but something colder, calculated. "Who did?" her father asked. Lena turned, eyes narrowing as she saw Ms. Radley and Mr. Carlyle step back onto the aircraft without a second glance. "The flight crew," she said, jaw clenched. Another pause. "Stay where you are," her father instructed, voice unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll take care of it." Lena lowered the phone slowly. Her fingers remained wrapped tightly around it. She turned to Toby, who stood beside her with a haunted look in his eyes, his hands clinging to his backpack straps. "What's Dad gonna do?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She shook her head, exhaling deeply. "I don't know, but I don't think they're ready for it." The terminal that had been buzzing with energy just an hour ago now felt different. Colder, distant, unwelcoming. People passed them by without stopping, barely glancing in their direction. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody cared. A second security officer stood nearby, arms crossed, posture firm, again watching them like they were a threat. Lena resisted the urge to glare. They hadn't caused a scene. They hadn't yelled or argued. They had done everything right. And still, they'd been removed. Their first-class seats, no doubt still empty, sat behind that door, waiting. Toby slumped into a nearby seat near the window, toying with the edge of his hoodie's sleeve. Lena stood, arms folded, mind racing. Their father, Colton Carter, was a patient man, but patience had its limits. And this crossed the line. Her phone buzzed. A message. "Dad, flight number, gate number, names, now." Lena's fingers moved fast. She typed back every detail. Gate E7. Flight 1886 to Eastbridge. Ms. Radley, Mr. Carlyle, sent. She knew that tone. Her father wasn't yelling because he didn't need to. Colton Carter handled things like a chessboard. No wasted moves, no unnecessary emotion. He didn't have to raise his voice for people to listen. When he acted, it made waves. She slipped her phone back into her jacket and looked at Toby. "Dad's on it." Toby nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained. "Do you think we're getting back on?" Lena hesitated. "I don't know." Toby looked out at the tarmac, his foot gently kicking the floor. "I didn't like how she looked at us," he murmured. Lena's hands clenched. "Me neither. It hadn't been their tickets. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a decision. One glance. That's all it took for Miss Radley to decide they didn't belong." More minutes passed. Neither spoke. Lena nearly reached for her phone again when the gate agent's voice broke over the intercom. "Miss Radley, please report to the front desk." Lena's head snapped up. Toby sat up straighter in his chair. "What do you think that's about?" he asked. Lena didn't answer, but she knew. She knew. Inside the terminal, Miss Radley smoothed down the front of her blazer, brushing invisible wrinkles from her uniform. She walked with that same forced elegance she always used in front of passengers, the air of control radiating from her every step. But she didn't like being called out over the intercom. Not like this. Not where everyone could hear. It made her look like she'd done something wrong, and Miss Radley hated that. She had worked years for this position, for the authority she wielded in the sky and on the ground. So, as she approached the front desk, back straight, eyes calm, she was already rehearsing a defense in her head. She didn't know it yet, but this time, no defense was going to be enough. Mr. Harlan, the gate supervisor, was waiting for her. Miss Radley spotted him immediately. His expression was neutral, unreadable, but his stance was stiff, like someone bracing for impact. She straightened her posture as she approached, trying to regain a sense of control. "You needed me?" she asked lightly, her voice laced with professional cheer. Mr. Harlan gave a small nod but didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned slightly and gestured toward the side entrance. There, an airport official stood holding a phone to his ear. The man's eyes flicked toward Miss Radley as he spoke into the receiver. "Yes, sir. She's here now." Miss Radley frowned. "Who's that?" Mr. Harlan let out a breath and lowered his voice. "We just got a call from corporate. Direct orders from Colton Carter." The name hit her like a rush of cold air. She blinked. "Excuse me?" Mr. Harlan's lips pressed into a thin line. "The two passengers you removed from first class. Their father isn't just some frequent flyer. He owns this airline." Ms. Radley felt her grip tighten around her clipboard. Colton Carter. Not a VP. Not some friend of a director. The owner. The man whose signature was on every company-wide memo, whose family name sat on the tail of every plane. Her stomach twisted. Mr. Harlan continued, voice measured. "Mr. Carter is personally involved. He wants an explanation. Immediately." Ms. Radley's heart pounded. This wasn't a warning. It was a warning shot. It was a misunderstanding, she said quickly, finding her footing. "I had reason to think the seats were incorrectly assigned. I followed protocol. I simply—" "You didn't verify anything?" Mr. Harlan cut her off, his eyes sharpening. "You assumed." The words stung more than she'd expected. For a moment, she had no reply. Mr. Harlan rubbed his forehead, sighing. "They're still waiting in the terminal. Corporate just issued new instructions. You're to escort them back onto the plane yourself. And you're going to apologize. In front of the cabin." Ms. Radley's breath caught. "What? You heard me?" His voice hardened. "Corporate's watching this now. The last thing this company needs is a discrimination scandal." She swallowed against the growing lump in her throat. Just minutes ago, she'd had full control of the cabin. The authority, the presence, the respect. Now she was being ordered to fix what she had broken, and everyone would be watching. "Of course," she said tightly, "I'll take care of it." But as she turned back toward the terminal, her mind swirled. She had publicly removed Lena and Toby from their seats. Now she would have to do the exact opposite. Walk them back in full view of every passenger who had witnessed it. She wasn't in control anymore, and she hated that. Lena sat stiffly in a row of molded plastic chairs, arms crossed over her chest. Her phone sat in her lap. She hadn't looked at it in several minutes. She didn't need to. She could feel what was coming. Toby sat beside her, his foot tapping the floor, hands nervously drumming against the side of his seat. He hadn't said much, not since they were forced off. Every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the gate where people continued to board like nothing had happened. The whispers were quieter now, but Lena could still feel them. The stolen glances, the curiosity, the silent judgment. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up immediately. "Dad, stay put. They're coming back for you." Her eyebrows drew together. "Coming back?" Before she could type a response, she heard it, the sharp, rhythmic click of heels. Her stomach sank. Miss Radley appeared, walking toward them like she had 100 other places she'd rather be. Her expression was tight, composed, but Lena saw it, the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her hands. Toby straightened slightly in his seat. "She looks mad," he whispered. "She should be," Lena muttered. Miss Radley stopped in front of them and cleared her throat. "Miss Carter, Mr. Carter." Her voice was strained. "There's been an oversight." Lena narrowed her eyes. "An oversight?" "Yes," Radley said, jaw twitching slightly. "After reviewing the seating chart, we've confirmed that your tickets are valid. You're welcome to return to your seats in first class." Lena didn't move. She studied the woman's face, the forced politeness, the way her fingers curled slightly into her palm. She wasn't apologizing. She was complying. She wasn't sorry. She was just doing damage control. She was angry, not because of what she had done, but because she'd been caught. Toby's voice broke the silence between them. "Do we have to go back?" he whispered, glancing between Lena and Ms. Radley. There was no excitement in his voice anymore. It had been stripped away, replaced with uncertainty, like he wasn't sure if going back meant reclaiming what they'd lost or just stepping into more shame. Lena looked at him, heart heavy. "We will," she said softly. Then she turned to Ms. Radley, her voice firm. "But I want to hear you say it." Ms. Radley blinked. "Say what?" "You assumed we didn't belong there," Lena said, her tone calm, unwavering. "I want to hear you admit it." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Ms. Radley's fingers twitched. Her gaze darted to the side, toward the gate desk, where Mr. Harlan stood with his arms crossed, watching her with the kind of scrutiny that left no room for deflection. Miss Radley's jaw clenched. "I made an assumption," she said through gritted teeth, "and I was wrong." Lena let the words hang in the air, tasting them, weighing them. Then she rose, grabbing her backpack. Toby stood, adjusting his straps. They followed Ms. Radley back toward the jet bridge, the polished tiles under their feet echoing faintly with each step. But it didn't feel like the same walk they had taken earlier. Everything had shifted. They were heavier now, not in body, but in burden. Ms. Radley walked ahead of them, posture still textbook perfect, but it was clear she was forcing it. She didn't turn around. She didn't check if they were behind her. Lena didn't expect her to. At the plane's entrance, the cabin crew stood in rigid formation. Lena immediately noticed the tension in their shoulders, the stolen glances, the way their smiles faltered when they saw her and Toby reappear. They knew. Everyone knew. Mr. Carlyle stood at the door, hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable, his voice even flatter. "Welcome back, Ms. Carter. Mr. Carter, your seats are ready for you." Toby hesitated, eyes flicking to Lena. She gave him a quiet nod, and together they stepped back onto the plane. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Some passengers looked away quickly, pretending to be engrossed in their in-flight magazines or seat-back screens. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Their seats, 2A and 2B, sat undisturbed, untouched, as if they had simply gotten up to stretch and nothing had happened at all. Ms. Radley stepped aside stiffly. "Please, take your seats," she said, her voice clipped. Lena didn't respond. She walked past her without a word, dropping her bag at her feet and sliding into the window seat. Toby followed, gripping the armrests as he sat down, his fingers pressing into the leather like he needed to anchor himself. The silence inside the cabin wasn't peaceful. It was thick, dense with tension. Then a voice cut through it. "It's about time," an older man muttered from across the aisle. He wore a tailored suit and didn't even look their way. His eyes were fixed ahead. But he hadn't been speaking to Lena. He'd been speaking to Ms. Radley. She stiffened but didn't reply. Another voice chimed in. Softer this time. A woman a few rows up. They never should have been asked to leave in the first place. That one landed like a blow. For the first time since this ordeal began, Lena saw something shift on Ms. Radley's face. Not defensiveness, not annoyance. Embarrassment. Without a word, Ms. Radley turned sharply and strode toward the front of the cabin, her heels tapping the floor in precise, rapid clicks. Toby let out a slow breath beside Lena. "That was weird," he muttered. Lena didn't take her eyes off the seat back in front of her. "She's not in control anymore," she said quietly, "and that's what bothers her most." Up front, Ms. Radley disappeared behind the curtain separating the galley. But Lena knew she hadn't gone far. The way she'd walked off so quickly, the tension in her movements. It was clear she was unraveling, just trying to keep it hidden. Toby shifted again, adjusting his seatbelt even though the plane hadn't moved. His fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest. "Are we really just supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" Lena didn't answer right away, because that was the question, wasn't it? Were they supposed to pretend this was normal? That being forced off a plane and paraded back on in silence was just another travel inconvenience? She didn't know what the right answer was, but she knew one thing. Everyone saw. And now, no one, not the crew, not the passengers, could look at Ms. Radley the same way again. "Are we really supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" Toby muttered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the aircraft. Lena didn't answer right away. She could still feel it. The weight of the stairs, the shift in the air. The same passengers who said nothing when they were marched off the plane now suddenly couldn't stop looking. Their curiosity, sharp and quiet, settled heavily over her and her brother. A flight attendant approached from the galley. She was younger than Ms. Radley, her movements more hesitant. Her name tag read Mel. Her expression was unreadable but not harsh, a kind of uncertain kindness flickering in her eyes. "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked softly. Toby didn't respond. He was hunched forward, hands in his lap, his shoulders still tense. Lena looked up at Mel and narrowed her eyes slightly. "Did you ask everyone else that when they sat down?" Mel's eyes wavered, but she didn't back down. "No," she admitted quietly, "I didn't." Lena let the silence stretch. She could have pushed harder, but instead she replied, "Water. For both of us." Mel nodded and walked away. Toby leaned in, whispering, "Why did you ask her that?" "Because she's trying to make things right," Lena said, her voice flat. "But she didn't do anything when it mattered." Toby slouched in his seat, sinking a little deeper into it. He hadn't even reached for the in-flight screen in front of him, which he'd been so excited about earlier. The glow in his eyes, the spark from before, was gone now, replaced with something Lena hated seeing: resignation. She glanced at her phone, still open to her father's last message. "Stay put. They're coming back for you." Her fingers hovered over the screen, ready to type a reply when the plane's intercom buzzed to life. "Ms. Radley, please report to the cockpit immediately." Toby sat up straighter, eyes wide. Lena's grip tightened around her phone. Whatever was happening up front, she had a feeling it wasn't going to be a routine update. Ms. Radley's heels tapped sharply against the floor as she walked toward the cockpit. Each step felt heavier than the last, her pulse quickening. She had never been called into the cockpit like this, not mid-boarding, not by name. When she reached the door, she took a slow breath and stepped inside. Captain Reese sat in his seat, the weight of decades in aviation behind his gaze. He didn't look up at first. His expression was unreadable, his voice low and clipped as he pressed a button on the control panel. A voice filled the room. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, controlled. "Ms. Radley, this is Colton Carter." Her breath caught instantly. Everyone in the company, from the cleaning crew to the executive board, knew that name. Colton Carter didn't just run the airline. He was the airline. The founder, the owner, the power behind every decision. And he was now speaking directly to her. Captain Reese leaned back, arms crossed. "Mr. Carter has a few questions." The cockpit was silent, save for the quiet hum of the systems. Ms. Radley's palms were damp as she folded her hands in front of her. Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move?" Carter interrupted, his voice steady, neither angry nor kind. Ms. Radley's throat tightened. "I was following procedure," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Silence. Captain Reese didn't look at her, but the way his jaw twitched made it clear he was listening. "That's not what I asked," Carter said. "Did you verify their tickets?" Ms. Radley's mouth was dry. "No, sir." Another long pause. "So you assumed they didn't belong in first class." His voice wasn't raised, but the weight in it was immense. More than anything, it was the certainty that unsettled her. "I misjudged the situation," she said, trying to hold her composure. Carter let out a long breath on the other end. "Did you question any other first-class passengers the same way?" The bottom of her stomach dropped. She didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. Captain Reese finally looked at her. The disappointment in his eyes said everything. Mr. Carter's voice returned, cool and final. "You will personally ensure my children receive the same service and respect as every other first-class passenger. You will issue a public apology to them in front of the cabin, and when this flight lands, you will report directly to the executive board." Ms. Radley swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." There was no response, only a soft click as the call disconnected. Captain Reese leaned forward slightly. "You heard him." Ms. Radley gave a stiff nod and left the cockpit, her steps suddenly unsure. She had been so certain, so used to being in control. But now, she had none. "You'll explain yourself to the executive board," Colton Carter had said, his voice like steel through the speaker. And then, click. The line went dead. Captain Reese leaned forward, adjusting his headset. His tone was laced with quiet disapproval as he said, "You heard the man. Now go fix your mistake." Ms. Radley nodded stiffly and turned, stepping out of the cockpit with her heart pounding. Her carefully maintained composure now felt like paper, thin, fragile, and close to tearing. As she walked down the aisle, passengers watched her. Some tried to pretend otherwise, their gazes drifting toward the windows or the screens in front of them. Others made no attempt to hide their interest, their eyes following her like she was the next scene in a drama they couldn't look away from. She reached row 2 and stopped. Lena sat quietly, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Toby was beside her, his fingers still playing with the hem of his hoodie, his eyes locked on Ms. Radley. For a moment, Ms. Radley wished she could just keep walking, pretend she had already done this, that it hadn't happened at all. But she couldn't. Not this time. She took a breath, forced her voice to stay even, and spoke. "I need to apologize. To both of you." Lena didn't look up. Her fingers ran slowly along the edge of the armrest, her posture calm but tight with tension. Toby, however, was watching, silent but focused. "I made an assumption, Ms." Radley continued, careful with her phrasing, "and I was wrong." Silence followed. Toby shifted slightly in his seat, then glanced at his sister. Lena finally turned her head and met Ms. Radley's gaze. Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Are you apologizing because you mean it, or because you got caught?" The question hit harder than Ms. Radley expected. For years, she'd been the authority, the decision-maker, the one passengers looked to for confidence and order. But now, standing there, she wasn't in charge, and she knew it. Her voice faltered. But there was no answer, and Lena knew that. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, not uncertain, but heavy, consequential. Miss Radley stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, her lips pressed together. She had said the words, but Lena's question still hung in the air, unanswered. Toby fidgeted in his seat again. He looked at Lena, waiting, unsure if this moment meant anything at all. Lena tilted her head slightly. Her eyes didn't waver. "Well?" Ms. Radley inhaled slowly, trying to hold together what little was left of her dignity. "I was wrong to ask you to leave," she said, her voice more subdued now. "I should have checked your tickets. I should have verified first instead of assuming." Lena shook her head. "That's not what I asked." Ms. Radley's fingers twitched. She had been trained to handle irate passengers, mechanical delays, even medical emergencies in the air. But this, a conversation where the power balance had flipped, was something she had never prepared for. Toby's voice entered the space, quiet but steady. "Would you have done the same thing if we looked different?" Miss Radley froze. The cabin, already tense, seemed to grow even quieter, as if the question had sucked the air from it. She opened her mouth, closed it, swallowed, but no words came out. She didn't need to answer, because Lena already saw it, the hesitation, the fear, the shame, and that alone told her everything she needed to know. "You can't even say it," Lena murmured, shaking her head slightly. Miss Radley's stomach twisted. She had spent years believing she was fair, professional, that her instincts were always right. But now, under Lena's steady gaze, all she felt was doubt, real doubt. She glanced around, almost wishing for an escape, a reprieve, someone to interrupt this moment. But there was no one. The passengers were watching. The weight of her mistake pressed down with crushing clarity. "I shouldn't have judged you," she said at last, her voice quieter. "I was wrong to assume you didn't belong here." Toby blinked, looking up at his sister again. Lena studied Ms. Radley carefully. She didn't just hear the words, she searched for something behind them, and found something, but not enough. "Okay," she said simply. Ms. Radley frowned, confused. "Okay?" Lena nodded and leaned back in her seat. "You said what you needed to say. I don't need anything else from you." That finality struck harder than anger. Miss Radley had expected yelling, maybe more confrontation. But this, quiet, collected dismissal, was worse. Toby looked between them. "You don't want her to say more?" Lena sighed. "It's not about what she says now. It's about what she does next." That silence returned, not heavy this time, but definitive. Miss Radley stood there for a moment longer, unsure what to do. Then she nodded stiffly and walked away, back toward the galley. She felt every step, every stare, and for the first time in a long time she realized she didn't belong either. The quiet in row 2 was heavier now, not from anger, but something worse. Finality. Lena's words hadn't been loud. They hadn't even been cruel, but they landed harder than anything else she could have said. Because her dismissal didn't scream. It declared, "I don't need anything else from you." That was the end of it. Toby leaned toward her, still unsure. "You really don't want her to say anything else?" Lena exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming softly against the armrest. "It's not about what she says now. It's about what she does next." A few rows away, Miss Radley felt her throat tighten. The apology she had offered, rehearsed, professional, delivered under pressure, had fallen flat. And maybe deep down, she knew it would. Lena didn't want words. She wanted proof. Miss Radley stood for a moment longer, then gave a stiff nod. "If there's anything you need during the flight," she said, her voice subdued now, "please let me know." Neither of them replied. She turned and walked away, her steps lacking their usual sharp rhythm. She didn't glance back. She didn't dare. Behind her, Toby let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He leaned toward Lena again. "Do you think she meant it?" Lena was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know." Toby sighed, slumping a little. "I still don't feel right sitting here." Lena turned her head slightly, scanning the cabin. Some passengers were still sneaking glances their way, pretending not to. Others couldn't meet their eyes at all. The energy in the room had changed. Lena could feel it. But she couldn't tell if it was guilt, discomfort, or something murkier. She looked out the window. On the tarmac, luggage carts moved in a practiced rhythm. The last bags were being loaded into the hold. Her phone buzzed. "Dad. Everything taken care of?" Lena typed back, "Me." She apologized. Not sure if she meant it. But, yeah, we're back in our seats. The 3 little dots appeared almost immediately, and then, "Dad. Good. Sit tight. This isn't over yet." Lena's stomach flipped. She had a feeling her dad wasn't talking about her. Meanwhile, Miss Radley walked briskly back to the galley, her mind racing. She had said the words. She had followed orders. But the tightness in her chest hadn't eased. The control she had always wielded, confidently, without question, felt like it had evaporated in the space of a few hours. She poured herself a cup of water, her fingers unsteady. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mel, the younger flight attendant, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You okay?" Mel asked, her tone even but not cold. Miss Radley tensed. "I don't need your concern." Mel raised an eyebrow. "Didn't sound like they accepted your apology." Miss Radley shot her a look. "That's not your business, isn't it?" Mel tilted her head. "You made it the whole cabin's business when you pulled them out of their seats in front of everyone?" Miss Radley didn't reply. Mel stepped closer. "I don't usually get involved. I mind my role. But I have to ask, did you even check their tickets before calling security?" Silence. Miss Radley's grip tightened around the paper cup. "You didn't, did you?" Mel said quietly. "I made a judgment call." "Based on what?" Mel pressed. "How they looked." The words stung more than Miss Radley was prepared for. She opened her mouth, to defend herself maybe, but nothing came out. Mel exhaled and shook her head. "That boy, Toby, he looked so excited when they boarded, like this was his first time flying first class. And now, he hasn't looked up since." She let that hang in the air before adding, "That's on you." Miss Radley swallowed, something uncomfortable building in her chest. Mel pushed away from the counter. "You might have done what corporate told you to do. But this isn't over. Not for them, and definitely not for you." Without waiting for a response, Mel turned and walked back toward the cabin. Miss Radley stood frozen, her hand gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles white. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she could recover from what she'd done. She wasn't sure if she'd ever feel in control again. Back in row 2, Lena glanced at her brother. He hadn't moved much since Miss Radley had left. His fingers tapped quietly against the armrest, his expression blank. "You okay?" she asked softly. Toby hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know." Lena leaned her head back against the seat. "Dad's handling it," she reminded him. "Yeah," Toby murmured, "but will it change anything?" Lena was about to answer when the intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." Toby sat up straighter, pulling the seatbelt across his lap. Outside, the plane rumbled gently as it began to taxi away from the gate. The moment of flight was approaching, but the heaviness in Lena's chest hadn't lifted. She glanced once more toward the front of the cabin, toward the curtain that separated them from the galley. Somewhere beyond it, Miss Radley was still trying to collect herself, and Lena knew, without a doubt, that whatever was waiting after this flight would change everything. As the plane began to taxi away from the gate, Lena glanced around the cabin. First class wasn't silent, but it wasn't comfortable either. The air felt heavier than before. The tension hadn't vanished with takeoff. It had only settled in deeper. Some passengers kept their eyes forward, acting as if nothing had happened. Others stole glances in their direction when they thought she wouldn't notice. Lena noticed anyway. Across the aisle, the man in the gray suit cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he muttered, his eyes locked on the screen in front of him, "that never should have happened." Lena turned her head slightly, her voice cool. But it did. The man looked uncomfortable. He gave a small nod and returned his attention to the monitor, not saying anything else. The plane lifted off the ground, the engines humming beneath them as they climbed into the clouds. But despite the rise in altitude, the weight in Lena's chest hadn't gone anywhere. She stared out the window for a moment, then glanced down as her phone buzzed in her lap. "Dad, landing in 3 hours. I'll be waiting at the gate." Lena's grip tightened on the phone. She didn't know exactly what her father planned to do when they landed, but she knew one thing. This wasn't the last conversation Miss Radley would have today. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and constant. But in row 2, the silence between Lena and Toby was filled with tension. Toby hadn't touched the in-flight screen in front of him, unusual for him. Normally, he'd be flipping through every movie, every game. But now, he sat quietly, staring blankly out the window. Lena's fingers brushed the edge of her armrest. Her thoughts looped back to earlier. The looks, the whispers, the silence when it mattered most. No one had spoken up when they were taken off the plane. But now, with the safety of hindsight, some of those same people seemed to want to be on the right side of the story. Too late. A familiar voice approached. It wasn't Ms. Radley. It was Mel. She stepped beside them quietly, her expression softer than before. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked gently, her eyes flickering toward Toby before landing on Lena. "Or something to drink?" Toby shook his head without looking up. Lena paused, then exhaled. Just some water. For him. Mel gave a quiet nod and moved away, returning moments later with a glass. She placed it carefully on the tray in front of Toby, who muttered a small, barely audible, "thanks," without lifting his head. Mel lingered for a moment longer. Then, in a low voice, she said, "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier." Lena looked up at her, one eyebrow raised. "Are you saying that because you mean it, or because you saw how things played out?" Mel didn't flinch. "Because I mean it." Lena gave a slow nod, studying her. "Then why didn't you say anything before?" Mel looked down, shifting slightly. "Because I've seen things like this happen before, and I always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She paused, her voice quieter now. "But that doesn't make it right." Lena didn't respond immediately. She simply watched her. Then she turned to Toby, who had finally taken a small sip of water, still quiet. "You work with her," Lena said, turning back to Mel. Mel nodded. "Yeah, she's been around a long time. People don't usually question her." "And what about you?" Lena asked. "Do you?" There was a beat of hesitation. Then, "I used to be one of those people," Mel said honestly. "I'm not anymore." Lena tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" Mel exhaled. "Because today I saw what it looks like from the other side." Lena leaned back in her seat, considering that. At least Mel wasn't hiding behind procedure. She was being honest, something she hadn't seen much of today. "If you need anything," Mel said softly, "just let me know." Lena nodded once. "Thanks." Mel walked away quietly, and for the first time since returning to the plane, Toby finally turned toward Lena. "You believe her?" he asked, his voice low. Lena sighed. "I don't know. Maybe." Toby pressed his lips together. "At least she said something." "Yeah," Lena muttered, "but she only said it when it was safe to." He didn't respond to that, but he didn't need to. The meaning behind Lena's words lingered between them, heavy and quiet. The flight continued. The minutes dragged by. Lena scrolled absently through old messages from friends who had no idea what she and her brother were going through. Toby eventually turned on the in-flight entertainment, but she could tell he wasn't really watching anything. His gaze drifted more than it focused. Then, the overhead speakers clicked on again. The intercom clicked to life again. "Ms. Radley, please report to the cockpit immediately." Lena's eyes snapped toward the front of the cabin. Toby frowned and straightened up in his seat. All around them, passengers shifted, some exchanging glances, others whispering quietly behind raised hands. Even Mel, who had been handing out drinks a few rows ahead, paused mid-step. Lena folded her arms. "Dad must be handling things already," she said. Toby blinked. "But we're still in the air." "Exactly." They watched as Ms. Radley, her face pale and unreadable, rose and began walking toward the front. Her steps were stiff, controlled, but something about her movements had changed. She looked smaller now, less certain. The moment she slipped behind the curtain to the cockpit, the whispers rippled through first class like wind through tall grass. But this time, the glances Lena and Toby received weren't the same. Before, people had looked at them like they didn't belong. Now, they looked at them with a new kind of awareness, as if they were no longer just passengers, but a symbol of something bigger. Two kids whose father had the kind of power that could summon a flight attendant mid-flight. Toby turned to Lena, eyes wide. "What do you think is happening up there?" Lena gave a faint smirk. "I think Ms. Radley just realized this is a lot bigger than she thought." And, for the first time since they boarded, the power had shifted. Behind the closed cockpit door, Ms. Radley's breath came shallow. The air in the room felt thinner than usual, the tight space pressing in around her. Captain Reese sat in his seat, arms crossed, his face blank. The first officer focused on his instruments, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. He knew exactly what was going on. Ms. Radley didn't have time to speak before the in-flight phone on the console buzzed. Captain Reese pressed a button, and a voice filled the cabin. Calm, controlled, weighted with quiet authority. "Ms. Radley, this is Colton Carter." Her entire body stiffened. Everyone in aviation knew his name. The founder, the owner, the one person whose authority eclipsed even the CEO's. And now, his voice was echoing through the cockpit. "I assume you now understand just how badly you miscalculated today." She tried to stay composed. "Sir, I don't," he said firmly, cutting her off. "I'm not interested in excuses." Her jaw clenched. Captain Reese leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on her now. "Corporate has already been informed," he said, his tone cool. "Mr. Carter has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing." Ms. Radley felt the blood drain from her face. "A review? I own this airline, Ms. Radley," Colton continued, "which means I ensure things are handled properly. And believe me, they will be." She reached out, gripping the edge of a nearby panel for support. "Sir, I acknowledge my mistake, but Do you?" he asked, voice still calm but razor-sharp. "Because I've received reports from passengers, crew members, and even your captain, suggesting that you didn't view it as a mistake at all, until you were forced to correct it." Captain Reese didn't look away as she felt the color drain from her face again. "You didn't just embarrass two passengers," Colton continued after a beat. "You embarrassed this airline." Ms. Radley's throat tightened, her breathing uneven. "Tell me," he said after a pause, "did you check the tickets of any other first-class passengers?" Silence. "Did you question anyone else the way you questioned my children?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. He already knew the answer. Her fists clenched at her sides. I wasn't thinking." "No," Colton corrected, his voice unwavering. "You were thinking. You just weren't thinking clearly." Captain Reese sighed and rubbed a hand over his face, clearly fed up. "Mr. Carter," he said, "what would you like us to do before landing?" "She will personally ensure my children are treated with the level of service every first-class passenger deserves," Colton replied. "Not because I care about their comfort, They already know they belong there, but because I want every passenger watching to understand what it looks like when someone is held accountable." Miss Radley felt her chest tighten as a slow burn of humiliation crept up her neck. "And, upon landing?" Captain Reese asked. Colton's answer came without hesitation. "Security will be waiting at the gate. She will be escorted to the executive office and explain her actions to the board. If they are unsatisfied—" A pause. "She will no longer be employed by this airline." The words hit like a sledgehammer. "Sir, please, this conversation is over." Click. The call disconnected. Silence followed. Captain Reese turned back to his instruments, but not before delivering one final line. "You'd better make good use of the time you have left." Ms. Radley stood there, frozen, the cockpit suddenly feeling colder than before, and for the first time in her entire career, she didn't know what to do next. As the call ended, Ms. Radley remained frozen in place, staring at the cockpit wall as if trying to will herself invisible. Captain Reese exhaled and turned toward her. "You should get back to the cabin," he said, his voice neutral but clipped. "I suggest you make good use of the time you have left." She nodded stiffly, her legs numb beneath her as she stepped out of the cockpit. The moment the curtain fell behind her, she could feel it. The pressure, the attention, the weight of judgment. For the first time in her career, Ms. Radley wasn't the one in control of what came next. Back in first class, Lena scrolled through her phone, her face calm but unreadable. Beside her, Toby had finally picked a movie, but she could tell he wasn't watching it. His eyes kept drifting, unfocused. Around them, whispers stirred. Passengers glanced forward toward the cockpit and then toward the siblings again, waiting, watching. Not for entertainment now, but for fallout. Then, slowly, Ms. Radley reappeared. She walked down the aisle with deliberate steps, her expression carefully composed, but Lena could see through it. Her shoulders were stiff, her movements tense. Her eyes didn't meet anyone else's. This wasn't the same woman who had stood over them earlier, demanding they move. This was someone who had just realized, maybe for the first time in her life, that she wasn't above consequence. She reached their row and stopped. Silence filled the space around them. Toby shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Radley took a breath. "Can I offer you anything? Drinks? A meal? Anything at all?" Her voice was tight, overly controlled. Toby glanced up at Lena, unsure. Lena didn't look at her right away. She studied her, slowly, deliberately. The forced tone, the practiced politeness. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't remorse. It was damage control. Lena leaned back in her seat, arms folded. "You didn't ask us that when we first sat down." Miss Radley's lips tightened. "I'd like to correct that now." Lena tilted her head slightly, voice quiet but pointed. "Would you be doing this if my last name wasn't Carter?" Miss Radley held her expression still, but Lena caught it, the flicker of shame in her eyes. She answered for her anyway. "No," Lena said softly, "you wouldn't." Toby let out a tired breath beside her. "I'll just take some juice," he muttered. Miss Radley nodded. "Right away." She turned without another word and walked quickly toward the galley. Toby leaned back in his seat. That felt weird. Lena kept her gaze on the aisle. "That's because she's not sorry," she said flatly. "She's scared." Toby hesitated. "Is that enough?" Lena thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said, "but it's a start." Moments later, Miss Radley returned with a glass of juice. As she approached, the cabin seemed to still again, passengers turning their heads slightly, trying not to be obvious. Some looked on with judgment, others with subtle amusement. But they were all watching. Lena knew Ms. Radley could feel it. For the first time, she was the one being examined. Ms. Radley placed the juice down on Toby's tray with practiced precision. Her fingers were steady, but Lena could tell it was effort. She forced a tight, robotic smile and turned quickly, eager to be anywhere else. She could still feel their gazes as she walked away. Lena's calm stare, Toby's quiet confusion. It was a feeling she wasn't used to. She had always set the tone, dictated order, controlled the room. Now she was walking through a cabin filled with eyes that no longer saw her as authority. They saw her as the problem. As she reached the galley, Ms. Radley's hands trembled slightly. She gripped the counter for balance, her breathing shallow. How had it come to this? One moment, she had been confidently managing the cabin, like she'd done for years. The next, she was summoned into the cockpit and scolded like a trainee by Colton Carter himself. The man whose children she had humiliated. The man who wasn't going to forget it. The truth of it sat like lead in her chest. This wasn't a customer complaint. This wasn't something a manager could quietly sweep under the rug. This was different. Now, security would be waiting at the gate. The executive board would be waiting for her. Ms. Radley had never faced anything like this in her career. Sure, there had been the occasional complaint. A passenger upset about seating, a tone taken too harshly, a policy enforced too firmly. But never this. Never judgment from the very top. Over the years, there had been passengers who thought Ms. Radley was too firm, too cold, a bit too sharp when delivering policy, but none of it had ever escalated past a politely worded complaint. Nothing that could touch her reputation. She had been, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. Not anymore. Now her grip on that certainty was slipping fast. She squeezed her eyes shut and inhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, if she handled the rest of the flight perfectly, if she showed real remorse, the board might give her some grace. Maybe Mr. Carter wouldn't fire her. Her fingers twitched. Then, with a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform, reset her expression into something polished and professional, and stepped back into the cabin. Eyes followed her the moment she appeared, but she pretended not to notice. She forced herself to focus on the task in front of her. She moved quietly through first class, offering drinks, checking tray tables, handing out warm towels with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She hated this feeling, the not knowing, the waiting, the powerlessness. And every time she passed row 2, she felt Lena's eyes on her, watching, studying, as if silently waiting to see what she would do next. She knows, Ms. Radley thought bitterly. She knows I'm not really sorry. She knows I'm just trying not to lose my job. Ms. Radley swallowed hard and kept moving. Lena tapped her fingers against the armrest, eyes following Ms. Radley's rigid movements as she passed. Everything about the woman now screamed discomfort. She wasn't walking like a leader. She wasn't offering drinks out of care or responsibility. She was performing, out of fear. Beside her, Toby sipped his juice quietly. His shoulders were still slumped, his eyes still dull. The boy who had practically bounced onto the plane earlier that day hadn't come back. That version of him was gone. Lena glanced toward the other passengers. Most had returned to their books, movies, or conversations, pretending the day had gone as planned. But she saw it. The quick glances up from screens as Ms. Radley passed. The whispers that trailed behind her like a shadow. The flight attendant hadn't just lost control. She had lost their respect. Lena's phone buzzed. Dad. Landing in 2 hours. Security is in place. Sit tight. She exhaled, staring at the message. 2 more hours. She wondered if Ms. Radley knew what was really waiting for her at the gate. Toby shifted beside her. I kind of feel bad for her, he muttered. Lena turned to look at him. Why? He hesitated. I don't know. She looks nervous, like she knows she messed up. Lena studied his face for a moment. Toby had always been the softer one between them, willing to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That doesn't change what she did, she said quietly. I know, he said, but what if she really is sorry? Lena exhaled. Then she'll show it, when no one's making her. Toby nodded slowly, but Lena could tell he wasn't convinced. Ms. Radley returned to their row once more, her expression unreadable. Would either of you like a blanket or a pillow? She asked, her tone stiff, robotic, practiced. Lena didn't respond right away. She simply looked at her. Not the uniform, not the smile, not the question. Her. This wasn't the woman who had barked orders with certainty, who had forced them off a plane in front of a silent crowd. That woman had believed herself unchallengeable. The one standing here now? She knew she had nothing left to stand on. No, Lena said simply. Ms. Radley gave a small, almost relieved nod and turned away without a word. Toby sighed. I still feel bad. You don't have to, Lena murmured. She made her choice. She just doesn't like the consequences. Toby didn't respond. He just sat back, silent. Lena turned to the window, watching as the sky stretched out endlessly around them. 2 more hours. For Ms. Radley, those 2 hours might be the longest of her life. The plane coasted into the late evening. The cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers had settled into their seats. Some dozed off. Others tapped through movie menus or scrolled mindlessly on their phones. But even in the quiet, tension lingered like humidity in the air. Lena stared at the countdown on her screen. The arrival time ticked down minute by minute, always moving, never changing the outcome. 2 hours. That was all that separated this moment from the next chapter in whatever came after this flight. Ms. Radley's chapter was coming to a close. The final stretch of the flight dragged on like a slow echo. Ms. Radley had spent the entire flight trying not to think about what would happen when the wheels touched down. But now, the thought consumed her. Across the aisle, Toby had curled up in his seat, eyes half closed. He wasn't truly asleep. Lena could tell by the way his foot kept tapping lightly against the floor and how his fingers fidgeted with the cuff of his hoodie. He wasn't relaxed. Neither was she. Her father had told her to sit tight, but Lena knew Colton Carter too well to believe that meant nothing was happening. Her dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He moved quietly, and when he acted, the consequences echoed. Ms. Radley, for all her training and experience, still had no idea just how loud that echo would be. Then, softly, a voice broke the cabin's hush. I just want to say, I'm really sorry for what happened to you two. Lena turned her head. It was the older woman from earlier, the one who had made a quiet comment after they were forced back onto the plane. She was seated 2 rows across, her reading glasses resting on her nose, a soft, almost tentative expression on her face. Lena regarded her carefully. Why are you sorry? The woman folded her hands in her lap, hesitating. Because I was sitting right here. I saw what happened, and I didn't say anything. Lena's chest tightened. I watched how that flight attendant looked at you, the woman continued, before she even said a word. "I saw the way she questioned you, and not anyone else, and I knew it wasn't right." She took a deep breath. "But I didn't speak up, not until your father got involved. And that doesn't sit right with me." Lena let the words settle in the quiet between them. She'd expected the forced apology from Ms. Radley, expected corporate spin, even anticipated meaningless sympathy from crew. But this was different. "You were scared," Lena said simply. The woman flushed slightly, but nodded. "I was." "Scared of what?" The woman paused. "I don't know. Causing a scene, getting involved in something I thought wasn't my place." She looked down. "Maybe I was scared of what it would mean if I acknowledged what was really happening." Lena studied her face. This wasn't like Ms. Radley's apology, shaped by fear of losing a job. There was no script here, no corporate polish. This was honest. Toby stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" The woman gave him a soft smile. "I was just telling your sister. I should have spoken up sooner." Toby blinked at her, still groggy. Then he shrugged. "Well, you're saying it now." The woman smiled gently. "I suppose that's something." Lena nodded once. Her expression didn't give much away, but something in her posture softened. "It is." The woman looked quietly relieved and turned back to her book. Lena sat back, her thoughts swirling as the cabin returned to its stillness. Beside her, Toby adjusted his hoodie, eyes drifting toward the front of the plane. Lena followed his gaze. Ms. Radley had returned, but she wasn't walking the aisle with authority anymore. She wasn't surveying the cabin with quiet command. Instead, she hovered near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, hesitating just a beat too long before stepping through. Her eyes darted from face to face, but never lingered. It was clear. She could feel the judgment now. She knew her presence no longer represented order. It represented something broken, something everyone could see but no one could fix with a hot towel and an apology. She had been judged already. And she had lost. Mel, the younger flight attendant, passed her on her way back down the aisle. As she approached Lena and Toby, her expression remained neutral. But there was something knowing in her eyes. "I wanted to check in on you," she said, her voice low but warm. "How are you feeling?" Toby shrugged. "Tired?" Lena watched Mel for a beat before responding. "Fine." Mel nodded. "I know today didn't go the way it should have." She hesitated. Then, glancing toward the galley where Ms. Radley now pretended to be organizing supplies, she added in a quieter tone, "I don't know what's going to happen to her when we land. But I do know she's never had to answer for anything before today." Lena tilted her head. "And that bothers you?" Mel exhaled. "It's complicated." "No," Lena said simply. "It's not." "It's not complicated," Lena had said. Mel had only smiled softly in return. "No, I guess it's not." Then she had stepped away, disappearing down the aisle with quiet grace. Lena turned toward Toby, who had been silently observing their exchange. His brows were slightly furrowed. "You think she really meant it?" he asked, voice low. Lena sat with the question for a moment. "Maybe," she said finally. Toby nodded slowly, thoughtful. "Dad's gonna fire her, isn't he?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, Lena looked across the cabin at Ms. Radley, who moved robotically between rows, refilling glasses, checking seat backs, all with that same forced elegance, like a ballerina going through the motions while the stage crumbled beneath her. Yeah, Lena murmured. I think he is. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if that would be enough. Miss Radley wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her reputation, the identity she'd wrapped around herself for years. And sometimes, that kind of loss hurt more than any paycheck. But that was the thing about actions. Once they were done, they couldn't be undone. And Miss Radley was finally learning that the hard way. The last hour in the sky dragged like molasses. Tension still blanketed the cabin. No one spoke about what had happened, but it was there, hovering, thick and unspoken. Miss Radley had retreated to the galley again, keeping her distance, likely hoping to salvage whatever thread of dignity she had left. Lena noticed the shift, not just in her, but in the entire crew. The energy had changed. Gone was the quiet camaraderie, replaced by avoidance and clipped professionalism. Even Mel, who had shown glimpses of care, moved more cautiously now, as though the whole plane was a pressure chamber ready to burst. Toby had finally returned to his screen, half watching a movie. But Lena knew him well enough to see it. The quiet tap of his fingers against his knee, his eyes barely tracking the scenes. That's how he processed. He didn't talk much when something weighed on him. He just sat with it. Lena checked her phone. Still no new messages from her father, but she didn't need them. She already knew what was waiting at the gate: security, executives, and a reckoning. Miss Radley thought she had already been through the worst of it. She thought the apology, the humiliation, the judgment from passengers, that was the end. But Lena knew better. The intercom buzzed to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are beginning our descent into Lakeford Regional Airport. Flight crew, please prepare the cabin for landing. Toby straightened in his seat, stretching. Lena exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the front. Miss Radley had stepped out again, her face unreadable. She moved down the aisle, handing out hot towels, adjusting trays, every task done with a precision that felt more like a defense mechanism than service. It was clear. She wasn't thinking about the passengers anymore. She was thinking about what was waiting for her on the ground. When she reached their row, she paused for just a second too long. "Tray, tables up, please," she said. Her voice was hollow, thin, the kind of voice someone uses when everything else inside them is fighting not to collapse. Lena didn't move right away. She looked at her, not just glanced, looked, searching for something, anything, in Ms. Radley's expression that said this was more than self-preservation, that she was sorry for what she did, not just for what it might cost her. She found nothing. Eventually, Lena folded her tray table and leaned back. Toby did the same, though he didn't look at Ms. Radley at all. The flight attendant lingered a second longer, then moved on. The plane dipped slightly as it entered final approach. The soft roar of wind against the fuselage filled the silence. Lena leaned her head against the window and watched the city lights below come into view. This was almost over. Or maybe, for Miss Radley, it was only just beginning. The wheels touched down with a smooth thud. A ripple of movement filled the cabin. Seat belts clicked open. Phones lit up. Passengers stretched, eager to reconnect with the world outside. Lena's phone buzzed. "Dad, I'm at the gate. No fluff, no reassurance, just fact." He was there. Lena turned to Toby. "Dad's waiting." Toby nodded, not saying anything, and he didn't need to. He knew what that meant. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the usual routine unfolded around them, but something was different. The atmosphere didn't feel like the end of a flight. It felt like the end of a trial. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. And Miss Radley? She hadn't moved. She stood near the galley, her arms folded stiffly, her face pale and expressionless. She wasn't focused on passengers or procedure or protocol. She was waiting, but not for luggage, not for paperwork. She was waiting for judgment. Dad, security is already in place. The executives have been notified. Lena exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid her phone back into her jacket pocket. Across the row, Toby sat up straighter and stretched, preparing to stand as the fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. "You think she knows what's coming?" he asked quietly. Lena turned her eyes toward the front of the cabin, toward Ms. Radley, who stood still near the galley, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "Oh, she knows," Lena murmured. The energy in first class shifted. Some passengers rose immediately, eager to grab their bags and disembark. Others moved slower, deliberately lingering, waiting to see what was about to unfold. And then it came, the moment of truth. The cabin doors opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside, calm and collected, standing just beyond the jet bridge. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply stood, his presence speaking louder than any announcement. That alone was enough to cause murmurs to spread through the cabin like ripples in water. Passengers turned their heads, not toward the siblings this time, but toward the woman who had once controlled this space like a stage. Ms. Radley's face blanched. She had hoped, naively, that she would be allowed to handle this privately, maybe even explain herself behind closed doors. But Colton Carter didn't believe in quiet consequences. This wasn't going to be handled in some back office. This was going to be public. A statement, a reckoning. As more passengers gathered their things, the security officer finally stepped forward. "Ms. Radley," he said, his voice polite but firm. "You need to come with us." Everything stilled. Ms. Radley inhaled sharply, her eyes darting to the passengers around her. Her shoulders tensed as if her body wanted to move, to flee, but she had nowhere to go. She was done. Mel, the younger flight attendant, shifted nearby, her face caught between sympathy and helplessness. She knew there was nothing she could do now, no line she could cross to protect her colleague. Toby clutched the straps of his backpack tightly. "Whoa," he whispered under his breath. Lena didn't say anything. She didn't look away. She watched as Ms. Radley's lips parted like she might protest, but no words came. She had been the voice of authority for so long, the one giving orders, deciding outcomes. Now the only thing left was silence and judgment. The same judgment that had followed Lena and Toby off this very plane just hours earlier. Now followed Ms. Radley. Except this time, no one looked away. From the cockpit, Captain Reese stepped out, his jaw tight, expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Ms. Radley directly, but he did give the security officer a small nod. "She's all yours." That was it. The moment it became official. The uniformed man gestured to the jet bridge. "This way, ma'am." Lena watched as Ms. Radley, the same woman who had once walked down this aisle with head held high, issuing instructions without hesitation, now moved with slow, reluctant steps. The whispers trailed her like shadows. And then she was gone, disappearing through the door with two corporate executives on either side and the security escort just behind her. The other flight attendants resumed their duties, pretending everything was normal, guiding passengers toward the exit with forced smiles. But the mood in the cabin had shifted. Something final had happened. something no one would forget. Toby exhaled. That was intense. Lena stood, adjusting her bag. Let's go. The terminal felt too bright, too big. After the enclosed tension of the aircraft, stepping into the open gate area was like stepping out of a storm and into blinding light. But none of that mattered, because waiting just ahead, standing tall with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away, was Colton Carter, their father, the man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, the man who didn't make threats. He just made things happen. As Lena and Toby approached, Colton scanned them slowly, as if checking, one last time, that they were safe. "Are you both okay?" he asked, his voice calm and even. Toby shifted beside Lena, nodding quickly. "Yeah, we're fine." Lena nodded, her breath catching just slightly. "We're fine, Dad." Colton studied her face for a moment longer. Then he nodded, satisfied, at least for now. But there was something under the surface, something still calculating, still moving. He turned slightly, just in time to see them. Miss Radley emerged from the jet bridge, flanked on both sides by 2 company executives and the same security officer who had come for her. She looked smaller, her posture rigid, her uniform still perfect, but it no longer fit the way it had earlier. Her confidence had been stripped away, layer by layer. Passengers who had exited behind her slowed near the gate, pretending to check their phones or look for signs, but really they were watching. They all were. Ms. Radley had become the story, and everyone wanted to see how it ended. Ms. Radley's uniform was still crisp, still perfectly pressed, but now it felt more like armor than authority. As passengers exited the plane, some stole quick glances in her direction. Others whispered as they passed, their voices low but pointed. A few lingered near the gate, pretending to check flight updates on their phones, though everyone knew the truth. They were there to watch. Colton Carter. He stood just a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the woman who had humiliated his children, not with rage, but with precision. He didn't need to yell. His silence said enough. Ms. Radley. For the first time in her career, the power dynamic wasn't hers. She had spent years deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, she was the one being questioned. A man in a charcoal gray suit stepped forward. "Mr. Legrand, Mr. Carter," he began, his tone carefully composed. "We are prepared to address this matter immediately." Colton didn't respond at first. His gaze remained fixed on Ms. Radley. Then he finally spoke. "You removed my children from their seats," he said, voice low but unmistakable, without verifying their tickets. Ms. Radley swallowed. I made an error in judgment." Colton tilted his head slightly. "An error in judgment?" She opened her mouth, but he continued before she could speak. "You humiliated them in front of an entire cabin. You made an assumption, not based on their behavior, not based on protocol, but based on what the question hung heavy in the air." Miss Radley's lips parted slightly, but she had no answer, because they all knew the answer. Colton let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone around them. Then, without breaking eye contact, he turned to Mr. Legrand. "I assume the airline will be taking immediate disciplinary action." Mr. Legrand nodded. "Yes, sir. Ms. Radley will be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. There will be an internal review and—" Colton raised a hand, cutting him off. "No need for a review." Ms. Radley flinched. "She's done," Colton said simply. The words didn't need to be loud. They were final. Miss Radley's breath hitched. "Please, Mr. Carter." But he shook his head. His expression didn't change, didn't soften. "You had no hesitation when you ordered my children off that plane. You didn't second-guess yourself. You didn't consider that you might be wrong. You were certain." He took a single step forward. "Well, now, so am I." Mr. Legrand gave a curt nod. "Understood, sir." He turned to Ms. Radley. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the airline is terminated." She blinked rapidly. But there was nothing left to say. Security stepped forward, and for the first time, she was the one being removed. Colton turned his attention back to Lena and Toby. "Let's go," he said simply. Toby glanced back one last time, eyes wide as he watched Miss Radley being led away, her steps slow and uneven. Lena didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned. As they walked through the terminal, the whispers followed them again. But this time, the tone had shifted. The curious glances held something new. Maybe guilt, maybe admiration, maybe just discomfort. Toby tugged gently on Lena's sleeve. "So, that's it? She's just gone?" Lena nodded. She made her choice. He hesitated. "Do you feel bad?" Lena thought about it. She thought about Ms. Radley, and the moment she looked at them like they didn't belong. She thought about how fast that judgment had turned into humiliation. She thought about Toby's face when he was told to leave his seat, about how his excitement was replaced with confusion, then shame. She thought about the stares, the silence from passengers, the way people looked away, and then looked again, once they realized who their father was. She thought about the cost of staying quiet, and the courage it took to finally speak up. Finally, Lena exhaled and looked ahead. "No," she said. "I don't." Toby nodded slowly, as if something inside him finally clicked. As they stepped out of the terminal, the evening air greeted them, cool and clear. The sky had darkened, but the city pulsed with life, lights blinking like stars too stubborn to fade. This moment was over, but it would never be forgotten.